And it is 1 o'clock, and that means that we are starting. Welcome to this seminar about malign information influence during the 2024 super election year, organized by the Swedish Psychological Defense Agency, MPF. My name is Katarina Tracz, and it is my pleasure to be your moderator here this afternoon. During this event that will be sort of a checkpoint halfway through this super election year of 2024. We will discuss what malign information influence attempts that have been observed so far in various elections this year, how, for instance, Sweden and the EU have resisted against attacks against the recent European elections, and how we best can protect ourselves going forward. With us to discuss these very interesting and highly relevant topics, we have a distinguished set of speakers and panelists who will share their thoughts and perspectives. Jakub Kalenský, who is Deputy Director of the Center of Excellency for Hybrid Influence in Helsinki. We also have Sandra Elvin, who is the National Security Director at Microsoft Sweden. And from MPF, we have Mikel Toison, who is the Deputy Director General of the agency. We will soon take part of their perspectives, and towards the end of the seminar, there will be a possibility for you, the audience, to pose questions. The seminar is in English, but I am here to translate questions from Swedish if you prefer to pose them in that language. So with no further ado, I would like to start by giving the floor to Jakub Kalenský, please.
All right. Thank you very much. Good early afternoon. Many thanks for having me here. It is my first time at Almedalen, and Gotland seems to be a very, very lovely place, and this event seems to be also amazing. And many thanks for all the care I'm receiving from the colleagues from the MPF. You are very, very kind hosts. Katarina provided me with a great set of questions. Malign information influence attempts and operations. What have we observed so far in the election year of 2024? Were the EU elections targeted at NFS? To what extent and by what actors? Perhaps it's worth pointing out that in the COE, we are not actually working that much on the tactical level. We don't have our own monitoring capacity, so I'll be talking a lot about what other people have observed and what is maybe my synthesis of that. But also a little bit based on the monitoring and detection that I used to do before I joined the COE, about all the years before that, because this might actually be my main point here. The information influence attempts are not something that starts 3 weeks or 3 months before the elections. In order to achieve success, the influence efforts have to go on for years. The old KGB masters of disinformation, they likened the effect of disinformation to a drop of water falling on a stone. It does not make difference because it's so strong. It makes a difference because it is persistent, because there are thousands and millions of drops falling on the same spot over many years. Sometimes you cannot use a dynamite or a drill to penetrate the rock. And in these cases, the gradual cumulative erosion is the mechanism that you are going to use. And this is something that we have seen from the side of Russia, which is the main information aggressor in Europe, in the last decade or even more. Already in the years leading up to the revolution of dignity in Ukraine, Kremlin has been building up their disinformation empire, the Russian state pseudo-media, which receive roughly $1.5 billion per year. Then the ecosystem of all the international proxy websites that tell you they are the only independent alternative to the lying mainstream media, but they actually just copy-paste the Kremlin's lies. They were building the troll factories, and not just the famous ones in Russia, in other countries as well. And they are capable of spending billions on these campaigns. Just very recently, the Ukrainian SBU uncovered a campaign on Telegram, just about denigrating Ukraine, just one platform, $1.5 billion. They are spending an enormous amount of money. Plus, they are spending money on cultivating the networks of paid agents, of fellow travelers, of useful idiots. And again, what we have tracked, or what the community has tracked, there are hundreds of millions of dollars spent on the support for various political parties and movements around the world. That's just what we know about. There's probably a lot more that we do not know about. Creating fake grassroots movements, fake civil society, fake think tanks, fake academics. Also, the sabotage acts, the attempts to cause harm in the physical domain or in the cyber domain, that is there to cause chaos, destabilization, to discredit the mainstream political parties, the mainstream political actors, the institutions that are taking care of the country, to send the message, your country will not protect you. And this messaging further strengthens chances of some anti-systematic movements, of some authoritarian politicians. They were spending billions of dollars on this. I'm not sure anybody has a precise figure how much money is Russia spending on these information and influence efforts. But it is obviously a budget of a small country. And they have been doing this for several years, very visibly since the Revolution of Dignity in November 2013. But the preparatory work that must have started already several years ago. When it comes to Europe and the European elections, this vast ecosystem, funded by billions of dollars, employing thousands of people, targeting hundreds of millions of people in dozens of languages. This ecosystem is trying to boost the chances of the far right, of the far left, of the climate change deniers, of the anti-vax movement, and they had been doing it already before COVID. They were trying to radicalize xenophobes with anti-migration messaging, the anti-LGBT, anti-feminist groups, pro-gun lobby, various paramilitary fighter clubs, all that with the strategic aim to destabilize our societies, to cause more polarization, to cause more hysteria, to make the debate more irrational, more reactive. And I think this is the election interference we should be also focusing on, this constant day by day helping to those political forces that Russia likes for one reason or another. The Kremlin spent more than a decade doing this, and then we have EU elections in which the movements repeating the pro-Kremlin disinformation succeeded to a certain extent. Maybe they didn't gain 40%, 30%, but they still achieved significant results. If we take just the biggest countries, far-right AfD in Germany, 15 seats, Sarah Wagenknecht 6 seats, Die Linke 3 seats. That's 24 seats out of 96 for politicians who have a history of helping Russian disinformation and propaganda. National Rally in France, 30 seats out of 81. Plus a few seats for former National Rally members in other movements. These are very good results, and I'm sure the Kremlin is happy about them. If you go to smaller countries, in my home Czech Republic, we elected both the far right and the far left. We elected also unreformed communists. And we elected this strange new movement, Motorists for Themselves, which is actually trying to save fossil fuel cars and is going to Brussels to fight the green fanatics. Again, spreading a message that is very much in the pro-Russian orbit. So we have around 1/4 of seats for people who seem to be in this ecosystem. In Slovakia, almost half of the seats went to the actors who were helping Kremlin's disinformation. In Hungary, it was more than 1/2. Can we pin all the blame on Russia? Surely not. But have they made some difference? Yes, even if it's very difficult to quantify precisely. But it's obvious that they made some difference. They are trying to accelerate the movement in some direction, in the direction that they like. And that can still be a very big help. If you are walking to a subway and I push you and I accelerate your movement, we cannot say I am blameless for the fact that you fell under the subway, just because you were on the trajectory there. And this is what the Russians are trying to do in the information space as well. And then we see some voices from Brussels, be it from EDMO, from the European Parliament, but also from many member states, declaring a victory in the fight against disinformation. We have not seen a disinformation tsunami. We have successfully deterred disinformation operations. I cannot escape feeling that this is looking at the wrong place. It is not just the tsunami you should be looking for. You should also be looking for this constant erosion, for those drops that started falling more than a decade ago and that keep falling day after day after day. And we have very obviously not deterred those. Russia is still continuing with them and is free to continue with them practically unopposed. The Kremlin's disinformation has, for some people, become a norm over the last decade. They already perceive it as a normal world. For some people, it has become a norm that 15, 20, 30% of the electorate in various countries is voting for movements that are helping the Kremlin's disinformation to spread. It has become a norm that in some countries these gains are increasing rather than decreasing. And in some countries, it looks like the actors helping Kremlin's disinformation have cemented their results for several electoral cycles ahead of us. And still some people celebrate this as a victory. Again, I cannot escape the feeling that this normalization of disinformation is one of the biggest successes of the Kremlin. One characteristic of hybrid operations is trying to play under the threshold of reaction. So when the Kremlin targets a society, when they achieve what they are aiming for, and when their victims declare this as a victory, this is not just beyond the level of reaction, this is also beyond the threshold of even detection, of even seeing what is happening. Just to wrap up, I don't mean to say that we are in a tragic situation, obviously not, and the situation in other countries is better than in those countries I described. I merely want to point out that I do not think that we are already in a place where we can pat ourselves on the back and declare a victory in the fight against disinformation and become complacent. Election interference doesn't always have to be about easily recognizable hack and leak operations that we have seen earlier, or about the fireworks and about tsunamis. It can also be about the gradual, patient work that, if conducted for several years, slowly becomes the norm, and the attacked society gradually accepts it as normal, perceives it as something inherent to us, something that is going to stay with us. And I firmly believe we should not accept this as the new normal. We are not in a place where we can declare victory. There is a lot more that we could and should be doing. And our Ukrainian friends who were on this podium just yesterday, many thanks to the MPF for inviting them, they can provide us with a lot of best practices, what more we could and should be doing. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Jakub, for that thought-provoking presentation. I have a bunch of follow-up questions, but I will save them until the panel discussion with all of you speakers. Until then, please, Sandra.
And I was asked to talk about what we see from Microsoft. So first, a bit of introduction and background to why I'm standing here. So my name is Sandra Lin. I am the, as mentioned, the National Security Officer for Microsoft in Sweden, and the spokesperson for Microsoft when it comes to security. Of course, a lot of cybersecurity, but also influence operations that we work specifically with. We have, and this has been, there's a story behind this. I'm not going to, bore you with it because it's going to take a time, but there is a specific interest from Microsoft as a tech company to invest in analyzing and understanding influence operations. And it has to do with the whole, digitalization of society and the trust in that. So we have a specific department. Since a couple of years, we made some investments and bought a couple of companies that were specified in cyber influence operations, as we call them. We see that we've been investing a lot in cybersecurity, and we saw that there was kind of a convergence between traditional, what we in Sweden used to call IT security attacks, and more softer cyber threats, for example, influence operations that are happening in the cyber arena, and that these are converging, that you can see that when you have an influence operations that actually originated in a cyber attack where information was breached, for example, and stolen and then used as a part of an influence operations, just to understand what is Microsoft's interest in this. So we have a specific department focusing on that. And when it comes to the election, this is super election year. It's ongoing. So we have this team currently analyzing a lot of things. But if you look at the EU election specifically, we saw that, just as Jakub mentioned, we just can confirm what Jakub mentioned is we see basically the same. And we did not see a big bang. And there was a lot of fear beforehand about, we saw the last US election, we saw the Brexit election, etc. What will happen in the EU Parliament election? Will we see the same? And we did not. But just the same as was mentioned, the continuous, as we say in Sweden, spitting on the stone, we see that continues. We also see a bit of influence operations targeting the French and the German elections more specifically than the EU election. But more a continuation on the influence operations we already saw last year and the previous years regarding, Ukraine specifically. If we look at EU and Europe, it's been very much focusing on trying to disturb the support to Ukraine. That is mainly what we've seen a lot of, and we see a continuation of that. But we see that a lot of other actors, of course, in Europe, we're very much focused, especially in Sweden, on Russia being, the big threat, and also having the history they have of influence operations since hundreds of years. Influence operations is nothing new. We've seen that throughout, human history, and especially when we look at wars. So that's not new, but how they are very good at adapting that to the evolution of society. For example, the digitalization of society, they're very good at that. So we see a lot of that, and especially now, China is also picking up on their skills in influence operations, trying more to polish their own or the world's view on them, etc. So we see, for example, in the Taiwan election that there was a lot of influence operations there, for example. So we see that this is a continuous process. And just as Jakub mentioned, what we're fearing is maybe not the Big Bang. And I think that us as humans, we typically are worried about the big bangs because those we feel, those we see. But if you take, if you're working with IT or business operations in general, the big bang that hurts your operations, maybe it puts you down for a day, is typically what you fear. But what could be even more harmful to your business or as to society are the continuous disturbances that are occurring a bit. They are small, below the threshold, but are continuously happening, and that is eroding, and that's more challenging to address. So we share that fear and that concern that we are too much focusing on the big bangs, and what we see that these states typically are very good at are keeping below the threshold. So that is what we're seeing, essentially. And I think that was the question you had to me, right, Katarina? So I will stop there.
Thank you very much, Sandra. I'm also looking forward to following up on some of those short introductions you gave there. Final introduction to our own Mikel Toison, please.
Thank you. Yes, and I was asked to give our assessment regarding foreign malign information influence targeting the Swedish part of the EU election. First of all, I would like to just put this, give a bit of a background. In 2016, the US president election, it was a catastrophe for democracy, I would say, because here another country attacked one of the biggest, most powerful countries in the world, and really made a mess of it. And they created a mess even after the election. And when you influence an election of a country, what you want to target is actually the ability to lead that country afterwards. It's not the election in itself that you attack, it's the ability to lead your country, either by creating chaos, either by affecting the results, or actually getting control of the individuals that are leading this country. And when 2016 happened, we had a good dialogue with American counterparts, and they actually opened up their whole system to let us learn more about what had gone wrong. And our major takeaway were actually 4 things that they lacked. The reason why the Russians were so successful targeting the US election in 2016 was that the Americans were not aware about the threat. They did not expect Russia to do this to them. The other thing was that they were not aware about their own vulnerabilities. So when their vulnerabilities were exploited, they were not prepared for that and deal with it, understanding that it was a vulnerability being exploited. The third thing was that they had no toolbox. They didn't know what to do when this happened. No methods whatsoever, really. And the fourth thing, they were not coordinated and organized. So they couldn't warn each other and they couldn't help each other. So in some instances, US government organizations saw they were under attack, but they didn't help each other. And this is something that we brought with us when we prepared for the Swedish election in 2018 and set up our organizations. these four pillars needs to be protected and dealt with. And today, I would argue that Sweden and a lot of other countries are prepared. We know about the threat. We know that we're vulnerable. We've been starting to share and work with toolboxes, and we're coordinated and we share information. And within the EU system now, there is a rapid alert system. So all EU countries have been reporting to each other, warning each other what's going on. So we can say that, okay, if that happens to you there, maybe we should look for that in our environment. So therefore, we came into this election in a very good position. So therefore, our assessment is that there was no massive coordinated information influence campaign targeting the Swedish part of the EU election. That's a long sentence, and it's filled with, how should I say, beware of that, it's very precise, because this is what we can see. As Jakub mentioned, we are under constant influence. So of course, we've been under influence. All countries have been affected and attacked. But this specific election in Sweden was not attacked in a coordinated, massive way, so it had an effect on the result. We could, though, see preparations. So a couple of months before the election, we saw that Russia were setting up different, let's call them home pages, places where they could actually produce and distribute their content. And we called this network Portal Combat. So there was actually a news homepage for each EU country's language, where they automatically produced Russian narratives. So of course we had a close look on this, because this is the preparation. If you're going to reach the population, you need to be out there. And so they had something. But these were small platforms, didn't have a big outreach, and we were, of course, worried that they would find a tool to reach our population, to attack them. And the closer you get to the election day, the more vulnerable you become, because the less time you have to debunk and handle the disinformation that has an effect. So, of course, we were on high alert, and we were sharing information with our international partners and our national partners regarding this. But really, nothing happened. Of course, they used these portals, but no one read them. And we were sort of sensitive and not sharing too much where they were and what they were, so people would actually make news of them and distribute them and help the Russians. So we need to be careful ourselves. On the other hand, what we could see, and talking to our partners, was that other EU countries were targeted more effectively, more organized than Sweden. And what we saw there was that they were trying to create polarization within these countries, and also polarization between countries and the EU in itself. So therefore, I would say that Russia has been effective to certain countries, but we can't say whether it was them affecting the result. It's very complicated to find out, but what we can say is that they have been very effective, and they targeted groups or countries that were more interesting to them. Sweden is a small country, we have very few seats, but the bigger countries were attacked, and countries where they had a stronger influence apparatus active, that's where they worked. So in this sense, I'm happy for Sweden, but I'm actually a bit worried for Europe, and I'll end there.
Thank you, Mikel, and I will ask our other speakers to join me here on the stage. We'll try to squeeze in.
Should be here with you?
That's fine. So I'm going to try to sort of tie together the knots of the different messages we have been hearing here. One thing that I take away with me is that there was no Big Bang in if we look at just the European elections now, for instance, and that's we live in a society where, with a media narrative and so forth, that is rather, you know, we're looking out for these large events all the time, whereas, as many of you have been pointing out, the major threat might be in the drop that sort of falls against the stone, or the actual spitting against the stone. I like that phrase, by the way. Just how are we aware of, how can we be more aware and vigilant of this type of ongoing, constant influence operations directed towards us? Can I start by asking you, Jakub? I'm sure you have been thinking about this quite a bit at your center.
Yeah. Well, when it comes to countering disinformation, I see sort of 4 bigger groups of countermeasures that need to be done. We first need to be able to detect it and document it, and for that we really need vast monitoring networks. In some of the countries you would see a problem that the central institutions, the central agencies might not see everything that's happening, for example, in the regions, that's happening in societies that are not in the center of their attention. It's a very nicely visible in Ukraine, where some of the actors in Kiev, when we were doing their research last year, they were telling us we didn't see anything like very region-specific anywhere in the country. And then we talked to people in Kharkiv and in Odessa, and they were telling us, well, actually, we saw a lot of campaigns targeted directly at us. So first of all, you need to be able to detect that, and for that you need to have quite a robust monitoring system where you cannot really worry about the overlaps. The overlaps are actually a much safer option than having gaps in the monitoring system. And the second thing is probably raising awareness about this. And again, here the number of actors is really key. So talking to people about this, but not relying just on one government public press release. We need to be having also other actors who will be reaching to other target audiences. The audiences are nowadays significantly more fragmented. The governments and the mainstream media already cannot reach 90% of the audiences they used to. So we need to be thinking more creatively. And again, in Ukraine, you would see local celebrities raising awareness about Russia's propaganda, stand-up comedians, gamer communities, talking to very niche audiences. So I think these would be the 2 things that should help in that regard.
So whole of society approach to counter this. Sandra, you can feel free to answer this also, but a follow-up question. You were talking about the convergence between different methods, such as traditional cyber operations and influence operations. Can you tell us a bit more about this, and perhaps give us an example also? If you don't have the freedom to be specific, you can sort of randomize it.
I can be very specific.
Oh, well, please be.
Always when you're specific, it's typically historic events, because that's more known generally, now it's sensitive to talk about. But in Sweden we had, and I can't remember the year, I apologize for that, but you probably remember, those of you who were here, it was in the lead up to the Olympics a couple of years ago, where you had the Russian kind of, what do you say, doping? You say that in English as well, right? Scandal. And the Swedish Riksidrottsförbundet was actually hacked. So they had their email hacked, stolen, read, and then used as a part of not a disinformation, but a misinformation campaign, you could say. And the aim of that was to demonstrate that, hey, look at the Swedish doping process. It also have vulnerabilities, so if you're, blaming us, you should blame them as well. That was the point, and that is how you typically do it. Like, you have a cyber attack with the purpose of stealing information that is legitimate, and then using it for your own narratives. So that's one example. So you need to work with understanding that, not just, the services, like we talk about ransomware, if machines aren't working, we cannot operate, but also understand that information that we think is harmless can be misused as well. But going back to the former question that I would also like to answer is that it is so important. I mean, analytics is super important, and we have our own analytics department, obviously, but that is after the fact. Analytics happens after the fact. And if we talk about defenses, and I know not the least because of this agency that we have here and the predecessors to it that has been working with this since the 1940s, I was not aware before I took this job, and the fact that that is building defenses, right? Ensuring that in our schools already, that our population is building their defenses, their information and media literacy. That is so important, and that is starting really early on. You have to do that before. And what we're doing, for example, we talked about, being where your audience is. So, for example, at Microsoft, we own Mojang Studios that has Minecraft, so we're using Minecraft education as one arena to help build that information and media literacy. Same thing with, we know gaming. The gaming chat rooms are one channel used for spreading disinformation, so you need to be there as well. So really understanding where is this arena, what is happening, because we know that these actors are aggressors. They're very good at finding those arenas. So you need to be there, and you need to build the defenses so that people can see through these influence operations attempts.
So new attempts, new methods also require new approaches.
Exactly.
Follow up, and Mikel, please feel free to jack into the other questions I posed, but I want to widen the questions. Jakub was saying that it's very hard to quantify the level of disinformation or malign influence attempts and its effects. Do you think that there would be easier? I mean, would there be any way to make this more possible? And in that case, could that have a larger effect also in countering influence attempts, in that you can show that these and these many attempts were made and they had this and that effect?
No.
I'm just thinking freely. No. Okay.
So
next question.
No. And for the simple reason that, okay, you can quantify it, but one tweet might have more effect than 300,000. It is about how the specific disinformation or deception exploits a vulnerability. So therefore, quantifying it doesn't really help. And to explain this even more, because this technique of spitting on the stone, why do they do this? Why are they constantly just sending these short messages instead of going for the big bang? Well, for the simple reason that if you do this once, a big lie, it will be exposed, it will be debunked, and we will know about it, and eventually that will never happen again because we've learned from our mistake. So what they do instead is actually these small things. They are trying to shift our perspectives, and the method and the reason why they are doing this is that they want to affect the leaders. They want to affect the decision-making of this country, because that's why another country attacks us. They want to control our behavior. But our leaders in a democracy, they can't make any decision. They can't make the decisions that Russia or China would like us to do. So therefore, they need to prepare our population, because if a decision maker would make a bad decision, they would lose their job, either every 4th year or as soon as a journalist gets hold of you. So what they do then is actually that they target both our decision makers and our population with small messages, shifting our perspectives in one direction that gets closer to eventually the big bang. And that's what's been going on in Sweden since 2015. Russia has been trying to shift our focus. And their major narratives are that you can't trust the politicians, you can't trust government officials, you can't trust media, you can't trust anyone except us on the more extreme side. So therefore, and now one final thing, and I want to let you in on us regarding the question about awareness. So I'll let you in on a state secret. So no recording now, please. What we do, as I mentioned, you need to be aware about the threat. So we constantly, when we have an opportunity, we will talk about Russia. I don't know if you remember the social services campaign when Sweden was attacked and the Quran burnings, and the first country we named was Russia. They weren't the major player, but it played in our strategic communication to keep up the awareness, because they are the major threat to Sweden. The other thing was to highlight vulnerabilities, but vulnerabilities is hard to talk about. So therefore, instead, before this election, we came out with a campaign called Don't Be Fooled, Bli inte lurad, which we use now and then. We don't talk about the election, but that is actually about taking care of some of the vulnerabilities that we have. And therefore, so that is how we work with awareness about threats and vulnerabilities.
Jakub will soon comment on that, but I want to throw in another aspect also. We were talking about this normalization of it, and not the big bang, but the constant drops of water or spit or whatever it is on the stone, and that this might in fact be the main success of the Kremlin, as you described it, Jakub. I'm thinking in terms of methods here. I mean, we're seeing, as Mikel pointed out, that they're trying to use new methods and new approaches all the time to caught us off guard. But in terms of like concrete new methods, there's a lot of discussion about, for instance, AI here and manipulated images and so forth. I would like to also throw in that aspect and hear that thoughts from the panel, and not the least from you, Sandra. But first, Jakub had a comment.
Yeah, thanks. Just about the effect on the previous question, we were since we are in touch with the practitioners in the participating states who are dealing with this problem, and we know that they are encountering this problem, and they have been encountering this problem for several years. So we issued a report on this, which came out earlier this year, and the authors, they found broadly three methods how you can evaluate the impact, although you can't always put a precise number on it. So one of them was when you have the disinformation penetrating from one channel, from the original channel, to another. That is clearly an impact, although we cannot say whether that affected 2 people, 10 people, or 5,000 people. We can't say that, but it is clearly an impact if the disinformation travels, and ideally if it travels from disinformation ecosystem into the mainstream ecosystem. And I'm a bit afraid that some traditional media are still sometimes helping it. So when there was this Tucker Carlson interview and Putin said, I will not attack Poland and Baltic states, and several Western media put this in the headline, Putin, I will not attack Poland, I will not attack Baltic states. And this is the guy who promised not to attack Ukraine as well. If you're quoting a notorious liar and you are not telling the readers immediately that these are notorious liars, you are misleading the audience. I'm sorry. But so this traveling from one channel to another or one environment to another, then the authors identified effects in the kinetic domain. And again, it's very difficult to quantify it, but when we have, for example, the Pizzagate shooter, Edgar Welch, who drove all the way from North Carolina to Washington, D.C. to fire from his rifle to save the kids from this horrible pedophile conspiracy. He was obviously affected by disinformation. We can't say that disinformation doesn't have an impact, although it's difficult to quantify how many people are affected similarly. But there have been numerous testimonies also of Russian soldiers going to Donbass saying, we are here to save the kids who are getting crucified by the Ukrainian Nazis, which is a notorious Russian lie. So it clearly has an impact, and it has an impact to the degree that some people are willing to kill other people. The third, which might be maybe the most easily quantifiable, are simple opinion polls. But unfortunately, they work only in very specific cases. So in those cases where we know that the disinformation originated in the Russian or Chinese or whatever other ecosystem. So if we have a message like MH17 was shot down by Ukraine, we know that it's a lie. We know that the lie started in the Russian ecosystem. Everybody who believes it is a victim of Russian propaganda, maybe through other actors, but they are also spreading Russian propaganda. So in these questions, opinion polls can tell us a lot. Unfortunately, they can't tell us a lot in those situations when the Russians just abuse the already existing problems in our society. So typically racial question in the United States or the anti-migration sentiments in our societies. There it's precisely this pushing in the direction where somebody is already going. How big a difference did they make? So far we can't measure it.
But we can see certain examples for sure that have been, as you mentioned, the shooting at the Pizzagate shooter, for instance. Perhaps highlighting these examples, I mean, that's one way of showing the direct connection. I want to move on to the topic of how new technologies, I mean, I'm sure you've all been looking at the new AI tools, and we've seen pictures already of, Joe Biden and Kim Jong-un cuddling or whatever. Can we even trust traditional images any longer, or should we just be prepared and everything can be sort of part of an influence operation to trick us?
That's a great question. And I think that it's hard to walk around here in Visby this week without stumbling upon a seminar that does not have AI in its name, right?
Yeah. I had to push it into the theme, even though it's not. Sorry about that.
No, but it's super relevant, definitely, because it's really difficult. I mean, AI, especially with the modern, generative AI tools that we have. AI we've had for many years, we should say, but it's the new generation of generative AI that can generate in a very, clever way pictures, images, speech, etc., and that can mimic, real persons in a very, authentic way. That is creating a lot of challenges. Of course, if we talk about information and media literacy, that puts, some additional challenges to that for sure. And Microsoft is one of 20 tech companies that have signed something we call the Tech Accord to combat deceptive use of AI, and specifically for the super election year. That includes a lot of different things, but especially when it comes to information provenance, understanding where is information coming from, but also if we talk about image and speech, etc., to be able to detect using AI that could be misused, but also, of course, used to identify images and speech that has been generated by AI, and we call it watermarking technology, to basically white label it and saying this is white labeled, it's proven authentic, and this is not. And here you need to be more mindful about, when you are watching this or listening to this, that this is not white label, so we don't know. So be mindful. So it's different kind of tricks in, both technology advances, but also in terms of transparency. For example, we don't have that, but you have Google and with YouTube, etc., understanding the algorithms, how do they work, how does information get pushed, etc. Those kind of, agreements on how do we as a tech industry counter these new threats that our technology is posing to society. So really focusing a lot on information provenance, information literacy, of course, but also technology to help us advance and counter the misuse or the deceptive use of these technologies.
All right. One last aspect before I open up the floor to the audience. I'm sure that there are lots of questions here. This seminar is sort of it's a checkpoint halfway for the super election year. We've been talking a lot about Europe, Sweden, and the US, but I mean there are elections going on around the world. I heard mentioned here that the main malign influence attempts have been observed perhaps in the elections in Taiwan. We had elections in India, the world's largest democracy, recently. I wonder if the panel, could freely share your observations from other elections, or it might be trends of influence that are going on that are not directly connected to elections around the world. And here, feel free to wave. Perhaps Sandra has the best insight here, but then feel free to add points.
No, but and I should say that as I am, focusing specifically on Sweden, I'm not the expert on what's happening, but I get, all the messaging internally in the report, so I try to keep up with them. But as said, of course we see, like I mentioned, now in Germany and France, that there are specific influence operations attempt against those elections as well. But what we see is that this is something that is picking up. That's a general trend that we see more of influence operations generally globally. That's a trend, like a negative trend that we see that is picking up generally in all countries. And of course that's tied to different geopolitical movements. So I mean it's not unexpected, but it's an interesting trend to follow how that is being used and how those methods are being used, that they're really following the development of society and really good at understanding, for example, the youth. I mean, how are they absorbing information, of course? And so it's really interesting to see that trend generally and seeing what they are focusing on. Like, for example, how do you support the right-wing movement in Europe to get a more kind of pro-Russia? Well, that is, trying to talk about immigration as an issue, for example, targeting those kind of topics that they're really skilled in understanding the ecosystem of information flow and ensuring to target that, and also how they are trying to impact, like we talk about information provenance in mainstream media, is trying to make those hops, right, from those channels that we typically are analyzing, understanding, but trying to make that hop so that it goes into mainstream media undetected or detected too late to be picked up and deterred. So that is some general trends that we're seeing.
And just to throw in there, we can go back to Europe also, because there are some pretty significant elections coming up. One on Sunday, which might make some of us a bit nervous, and then there's forthcoming elections in other major European countries as well. I'm talking about the election in France on Sunday. Any thoughts, reflections, observations ahead of that?
Yeah, well, not the French election, well, except that, well, they are in a high-risk environment, but they've also really increased their capabilities for protecting their own election. And they now Visionum, an organization that is sort of similar to us, not as broad mandate, but almost as cool as we are, and effective. They are really effective, so they are there. But I would like to highlight also that since Russia has lost a lot of impact on certain countries within the EU, and especially in Sweden, we've seen how they took their old influence infrastructure with RT, Sputnik, and the hang-around organizations and vectors they were using to spread their propaganda and disinformation. And they've refocused that on Latin America, Africa, and certain parts of Asia. So they have a focus on the rest of the world now that in a way they didn't have before, which is a problem for the upcoming elections globally.
The UK elections, just yesterday, a piece of news came out that the recent cyber attacks against the National Health Providing Service were actually aimed again at causing chaos and destabilization before the UK elections. So that was again one of these attempts, like trying to destabilize society, trying to portray the current ruling party, but also the government institutions as incompetent to protect their citizens. So that might be relevant for the UK elections. And I mean, I have to admit I'm slightly nervous about the French elections because from the results of the European elections, and hopefully the far right does not repeat these gains. Usually the French far right outperforms in European elections compared to the national elections, and we've already seen it two election cycles back, but I think that's troubling. When it comes to AI, maybe Slovakia is quite an interesting example, although it's already from last year, but there was this audio deep fake of the main opposition candidate accusing him of plotting to falsify the elections, which was the first major accusation. The second major accusation was that they are going to raise the prices of beer, which obviously in our region is a criminal activity, and every government that does that falls. So that, but from what I read in some reports, that might actually be the bigger threat with this AI, that not so much maybe the images yet, the videos, maybe in a few years, yes, but currently the bigger threat is the audio, because that's almost indistinguishable from the original. And if I were to pick like one trend that I'm slightly worried about, it's this information laundering, the way how Russians are increasingly getting better at hiding themselves as the source of disinformation. When we see something from China, and I am worried about their resources, I'm worried about their potential, but they are still slightly clumsy, and it's very quickly visible that this is coming from China. Russians are getting better and better at hiding the source of disinformation, reaching out to local amplifiers, to local actors. There was even several years ago a warning from a German secret service, and when the Germans warn against Russian influence, it has to be already a big thing, because they don't usually do this. Be aware of the fact that the Russians are trying to reach out to Bundestag members who would be helping them to spread disinformation campaigns for them. And I do worry that they are increasingly getting better at that. They are circumventing the blocks that EU introduced against Russia Today and Sputnik. They are trying to find other channels to reach the audiences. So this might be the one trend that I find slightly disturbing.
All right, thank you. With that, I would like to open up the floor for questions, comments from the audience. I see many hands already. Please introduce yourself once you reach the microphone, and if you want to ask your questions in Swedish, that is fine too, and I will translate.
Olle Schlander, I'm representing Swedish Defense Society. Katarina, she has been in the board for a couple of years, so she knows me and also the organization. In a way, I got the answer now last 3-4 minutes, but I'm thinking about here this week, we have all the heads of the political parties. Maybe you can see or be suspicious that there has been something going on lately targeting this Almedalen event. What do you say about this? Can it be like this? Thank you.
Perhaps that's the question for our Swedish participants. Any specific influence operations against an event such as Almedalen?
I mean, same thing here. We have not seen a big bang kind of like coordinated effort, but there is constantly, if you look at like social media, for example, doesn't matter if it's X or if it's, YouTube or if it's, LinkedIn or whatever it is. I mean, of course, we see a continuous flow, and as always, when we talk about, inhemsk, like interior threats, it's always, the question is what qualifies as malicious, right, or malign. That's the attempt. What's the intent, and how has that kind of information flow happened? Is it a citizen that is just concerned, or is there malign influence behind it? That's always tricky, right? But for sure, as always, we see, and we see social media more used, we see more agents, if you like, involved in spreading different kinds of narratives related to events like Almedalen. Almedalen is not unique, but for sure, Almedalen is definitely a target of that kind of. But we haven't seen coordinated. It's been more like pockets, if you will.
Yeah, to add on that, one of the methods that Russia is using is amplification nowadays, since their narrative doesn't really work. So they cherry pick bad news about Sweden and amplify that and try to reach certain groups with this. And of course, hatred against politicians or anyone who would go to this event is one of their narratives. So in that sense, it has been ongoing for quite some time. Otherwise, a big boom of attack we haven't seen, because then we would have known it. Then we would have talked about it here now also.
Thank you. We have one more question here in the middle. Please introduce yourself.
Thank you. Is this on?
Yeah.
Okay, sure. So my name is Fredrik Wikström. Thank you for this event. I'm here in Almedalen for AI Sweden, but this question is for me personally. So I'm just curious. We've seen, to my mind at least, a quite severe change in the support on the Israel-Palestinian issue in the West. A long sort of change, it seems, over an extended period of time. So my question is, are there any outside influences towards the West on this issue, and who would be the main contributor to this change and this influence operations?
Thank you for that question.
Yes.
Anyone feels
Is
compelled to
the answer?
take it?
Yes.
Yeah.
Short answer. We see that a lot of activity, both cyber attacks in general, but also influence kind of operations and flows, are developing in the Middle East. Of course, we see a large pickup there generally. For example, we saw that, the US and UK has traditionally been the most targeted countries from a volume because of their size, their market size. But Israel actually took on that kind of top position just following, I think it was in December, November. So there was kind of a incoming from the, especially Iran, but generally when we talk about the Middle Eastern area. And we see that has also impacted cyber influence activities. So we see not just in Sweden, but also in Sweden, of course, that there are a lot of attempts, for example, in social media to as you say, to amplify messages, but also to try to kind of, point seeds at different types of narratives that are especially, I would say, it's both ways, but especially against Israel, I would say. We see that from a volume perspective, that it's more anti-Israel and pushing for Hamas, for example, more of that from what we see globally. So those are some of the trends that we see for sure, yes. So, yes.
Yeah, and to begin with the 7th October terrorist attack, it was a terrorist attack, but it wasn't a clandestine attack. It was an influence operation. They had cameras, they live streamed, they really wanted to promote their event. So Hamas had a plan to actually stir things up and influence the rest of the world. So that is one part. One thing that we've seen is that Sweden has been, since the attack on social services and Quran burnings, we've been one of the major targets for Islamist influence, malign influence actors. A lot of their focus have now shifted towards the Israel-Hamas war and the now ongoing war in Gaza. So I can say that the influence actors, because we could classify them as influence actors targeting Sweden, they're now active there. And unfortunately, to add one more thing into this that we've seen as a trend since late 2022 is that you have violent extremists like Daesh and Al-Qaeda, they're doing propaganda, and then you have the non-violent extremists, so that could be Muslim Brotherhood affiliated and so on. And what we see now is that the non-violent extremists, they are aligning their narratives more and more with the violent extremists. So there is a radicalization and polarization when it comes to the Islamist world towards the West. So yes, there is a full-scale influence campaign going on with several actors being active.
I'm mostly focused on Russia, but they are very active in this particular conflict. They actually had been interested in this region and in these dividing lines, so to say, ever since the creation of the State of Israel. There was actually a certain period when they were promoting pro-Zionist messaging, but very soon after that they went into heavily pro-Palestine, anti-Israeli messaging. In this whole grand narrative, let's spread anything that is anti-Western. So Israel is supported by the United States, so we have to attack Israel. And I am pretty sure it also helps them in many Arabic-speaking countries, for example, in Africa, which is where they have been definitely even more successful than in Europe.
Thank you very much for that question. We have time for one final question.
Hello. Is it on? Yes. Well, my name is Nina. Thank you very much to the panel. I am wondering where I'm going to move so you can see me properly. Sorry. So my question comes more towards the inner attacks that we can get, attacks from our own, because sadly we have senseless idiots and malign idiots nationally as well. And in particular, I'm wondering, as an Argentinian, where we have both of these and they have access to state resources. So my question is, what are our tools that we can use to defend ourselves as voters against these attacks?
I'll start first by saying that this is a question I can't answer, since we are a national defense agency only authorized protecting Sweden against foreign threats. So I will stay silent.
You can answer from perhaps other countries or a more European perspective.
Yeah, sure. No, obviously this is a very big problem when we have the government or influential politicians using exactly the same tools. I still see a very big difference between somebody who has this very big apparatus that has been built up for decades, has the decades of experience, and somebody who's kind of a newcomer to this field. I still consider Russia to be more dangerous. However, especially when there's a convergence of these actors, like we see, for example, in Hungary, in Slovakia, then the cocktail is obviously very dangerous. The toolkit of countermeasures that I was talking about, this detection and documentation, raising awareness, and then there are other tools as well. I deliberately designed it in a kind of result-oriented way. So we are not talking about the actor who is supposed to do that. We are talking about what are we trying to achieve. And in many countries, the government does not help. In some countries, the government even does harm. And there, it's simply up to the media. It's up to the civil society, and nobody else can step in. If they don't do it, nobody will do that. It is on us to actually support these actors, and UK, US, and Sweden are probably among the biggest supporters of these think tanks or civil society organizations. But I think Europe as a whole could be doing significantly more. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you very much. First of all, to our panel, who have stood here for an hour in 30+ degrees and answered everything eloquently without, melting away, although I'm on my way. Thank you. And as a small token of appreciation, on behalf of MPF, I would like to hand you a small gift. Thank you very much. Thank you also to you, the audience, for joining us here for this seminar. If you stick around or take a walk and come back in half an hour, we'll have another very interesting seminar on this theme, this time focusing on malign information influence attempts against specifically the US elections. So that starts at 2:30. So with that, another big round of applause for the audience and to you.